For those of you that don't know me so well, because I have been in the parish now for about 40 years in September, if I remember rightly. I used to be a teacher at Presentation College, hence a good connection with Father Michael being a good Cork man. When I was teaching, it fell upon us from time to time to do an assembly. And there was always a pretty good chance that my assemblies would be on one of two subjects. They were my standard fallback subjects, because many of you will know that I'm involved with hospital radio at the Royal Berkshire Hospital, and that's served me a very useful purpose on quite a few occasions. And another major part of my life is my involvement in Lourdes. So the talk that I'm going to give you this evening, it's on an introduction to St. Bernadette, to the message of Lourdes, and the notion of hospitality. So I think most of us know, at least in general terms, of the existence of Lourdes. I know that when I was brought up in the north of England, in our parish, Lourdes was very often spoken about, because they used to have fundraising events like a bingo every Sunday night, run in the Knights of St. Columba Club, that would be raising money for the Lourdes Sick Fund, and sending those pilgrims who were disabled or sick and didn't necessarily have the means to travel to the Shrine of Lourdes themselves, was one of the main fundraising activities that our parish, and I'm sure lots of others, had. How many of you know where Lourdes is exactly? Well, on the map of France, you might notice that it's way, way down, almost as far south as you can go. Very, very close, only about 30 kilometers away from the Spanish border, of course, in the Pyrenees. Also on that map, you'll see marked, of course, with the yellow circle, Paris, and the town of Nevers, which we'll come to in a moment, almost right slap bang in the center of France. Lourdes dominated a particular valley on that Spanish border, and for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, the only landmark in Lourdes was the one you see on your left, the castle, which was a strategic point, because it was important in the defense of what they used to call the Holy Roman Empire, when the insurgents, when the Moors and the Saracens who'd occupied Spain were trying to make incursions into Christendom, so to speak. This is going back to the time before and during the Crusades. But of course, nowadays, it's the picture on the right that you're more likely to see if you look up Lourdes on Google. And that's the main and the oldest of the basilicas in Lourdes. In fact, there are two of them there, because the big spire at the top is the Immaculate Conception Basilica, but just underneath it, you can see a sort of marble frontage. That's actually at the base of a hill that has the Immaculate Conception Basilica built on the top of the hill. And the basilica at the bottom is the Rosary Basilica. And the whole reason why those basilicas are there, of course, is because of this young lady, Bernadette Soubirous. Quick quotation from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, who tells us, just very soon after he begins that letter, God chose those who by human standards are fools to shame the wise. He chose those who by human standards are weak to shame the strong. Those who by human standards are common and contemptible, indeed those who count for nothing, to reduce to nothing all those that do count for something. And Bernadette Soubirous really fitted into that category in so many respects. Foolish is not quite the word for it. And I would say she wasn't contemptible, but she was certainly held in contempt by many, many people in her teenage years. Just to explain, She was born in January 1844, and she was born in that building that you can see, Le Moulin de Bully, which is actually a mill. She was the oldest of 4 children. Francois and Louise were her parents, and Louise had the tenancy of the mill in her family, historically, going back many, many years. Francois married Louise basically so that he could take over the running of the mill when Louise's father died. You could almost call it a marriage of convenience, but it wasn't. And in fact, it's quite important that Louise's mother, when she was widowed, was looking for a suitor, looking for a suitable husband for her eldest daughter. Because logically, they had no sons. There wasn't a man in the family who could keep the business going, grinding the corn, making the flour. So logically, they needed a man. And Francois, with the best will in the world, took one look at the eldest daughter, whose name, as it happens, was Bernard, Marie Bernard, a name that eventually was given to the daughter. But he said, yeah, she's a nice lady, but to be honest, I don't have any real feelings for her. Now, your next daughter, Louise, on the other hand, now I'd be very happy to marry her. So straight away, we learn a lesson there, because he didn't marry the person that was chosen for him. It effectively what was an arranged marriage, and we hear so much of those in certain cultures these days. He married for love. And the family enjoyed a happy, pleasant time in the mill, which they actually called the Mill of Happiness. Unfortunately, history, fate stepped in, and a whole series of epidemics of cholera and tuberculosis, drought, economic crises in France as a result of those, which led to the government giving out emergency supplies of corn and flour for free. They robbed Francois of his business. The Industrial Revolution was a factor as well, because being a small and relatively independent water mill, he was finding it increasingly harder to keep up with the competition of the steam-driven mills in other parts of the country. He was a good, kind Christian soul, but added to that, he was not a very good businessman, because when people couldn't pay him, which happened increasingly as the country was going through an economic crisis, he was less than assiduous about chasing up the unpaid bills. He'd be happy to let them pay later, which of course sometimes they did, but often they didn't. So as a result of that, the family had to leave the mill in 1854. And as the years went by, over the next 4 years, going from mill to mill and house to house, lodging to lodging, with less and less money, they fell further and further into poverty and destitution. And actually, they became something of a laughingstock. They were a subject of gossip in the village. So Bernadette, for instance, saw her father accused of theft at one point. And the guy who accused him of theft had absolutely no grounds for saying that, other than the fact that he thought he was poor enough to have a motive for stealing it. But poor old Francois spent a night or two in prison, in custody in the police station. And of course, you know what they say, mud sticks. Anyway, Bernadette, who herself had suffered as part of the outbreak of tuberculosis, she suffered from asthma. She had to muck in and work wherever she could, even scavenging, to help the family. Partly as a result of that, she fell behind in her education. Well, I say fell behind because, of course, most people in those days didn't receive education. There were no such things as state schools. You were lucky if you had a monastery or a convent where the nuns and monks would provide some form of education. But Bernadette, when she was 14 years of age, still couldn't read or write. And she didn't speak French because she spoke the local patois, the local dialect, which was called Bigourdin, a sort of a dialect of Occitan. I'm boring you with technical linguistic terms that we won't dwell on. In the summer of 1857, Bernadette moved out of the family home. So she was only 13. And she moved out of the family home and spent about 6 months in a place called Barthez, a little village not too far from Lourdes, a lady who had been a friend of the family in her childhood days and had actually helped to nurse Bernadette when she was a baby. She went to work on the little farm or small holding that she had, and you can see part of it there. There are images, the popular image of Bernadette, perpetuated by certain pictures that you see and statues, including in the grounds of the shrine at Lourdes. There's the image that she was a shepherdess. Well, that was only one of the many jobs that she did. And as I say, it was only for about 6 months. She also worked serving beer in cafes and was at the beck and call of everybody, doing whatever work she could, because her father was finding it harder and harder, particularly after his brush with the law. He was finding it harder and harder to find work himself. She didn't stay any longer than 6 months in Bartres, though, for a very good reason. At the age of 14, which was already fairly late, she wanted to make her first Holy Communion, which involved learning your catechism. Now, the priest in Bartres was one that she would have got on with quite well, and she was looking forward to having some catechism classes with him. But unfortunately, around about the time she arrived, he departed to join a monastery. So she was dependent on this lady that she was working for and living with, Marie Laguez, to help her learn by heart the responses to the catechism. You remember the catechism, don't you? Who made you? God made you. Why did God make you? God made me to love him and serve him in this world and to be forever with him in the next. And if I'm honest, that's all I can remember of the catechism that I learned when I was at a Catholic primary school up in Barrow-in-Furness. These responses were in French, which meant even less to Bernadette because it was a language that she did not speak. It was effectively a foreign language to her. So she was not making progress with memorizing her catechism. And in fairness, Marie was not a very good teacher. So the decision was made that she went back to Lourdes in January 1858, even though it was an extra mouth for the family to feed, because there at least she knew the parish priest and there were people in the church who could help her with her catechism. She was a girl of faith. In January 1858, at that point, the family had moved to the cachot. The cachot, which was not a house, but just one room in a house. Yep, parents and 4 children living in one room. And it was a damp, squalid, dark room, not in any way suitable for a girl in her state of health, but it was all that they could find. And in fact, it was a room which had served previously as part of the local police prison. They'd actually kept convicts there, although not Bernadette's father when he was taken in for questioning. And the authorities had decided that it was not a fit enough place to keep the convicts, but it was the only place where Bernadette and her family could live. But as we see here, she was hardworking, she was honest, she was a good character, she had faith, and we're told that the family could often be heard by their neighbours reciting the rosary and their night prayers together. And despite all the trials and tribulations that they faced, you know that famous saying that I think it was Father Fulton Sheen who coined it, the family that prays together stays together. And that's what they did. But history took an unexpected turn when, as we know, the 18 apparitions took place. Our Lady appeared 18 times to Bernadette in the Grotto. Now, the Grotto, that's a word that makes us think of, well, it makes you think of Father Christmas, Santa's Grotto. A grotto is a magical place. The Grotto in Massabielle was anything but magical. It was the local rubbish dump. It was way, way out on the edge of town in an area that people would not go to out of choice unless they were going to dump stuff that they didn't want anymore. And on the morning of Thursday, the 11th of February in 1858, Bernadette set off with 2 other girls, one her sister, Juanette, and another girl, a friend, and they were going to look for firewood. And somebody has suggested that they'd have a pretty good chance of finding some firewood down by Massabielle, possibly a few bits of furniture that people had disposed of, and also quite possibly some wood, driftwood, that had come down the river, because Massabielle was right by the river. In fact, they had to cross over parts of the river. The ground was very marshy and boggy, and Bernadette, with her asthma, was slower to get across than the others. She was not too sure about whether she should take off her wooden clogs to wade through the water. But she eventually did, but she became separated from the others. And when the others actually saw her, they were amazed by what they saw, because Bernadette was having an encounter. Bernadette said the first thing she heard, or the first thing she noticed, was a noise like a gust of wind. Now, you probably know times in the New Testament when a gust of wind tells you that God is present, or God is about his work. Think of Pentecost, when the disciples were together in that upper room, and the first thing they knew that something was going to happen was the gust of wind. Something was definitely going to happen that day, because Bernadette saw up in the niche of the rock, she saw what looked like a sort of a ball of light. She didn't know at first what it was, and it certainly didn't immediately take the form of a lady. Bernadette was petrified. Now, like a good Catholic girl, she had her rosary with her. She took the rosary. She wanted to make the sign of the cross, not specifically to pray, I think just literally to bless herself, to protect herself, to ward off what might be an evil spirit. But she couldn't. The lady, as she eventually appeared, was dressed in white, but Bernadette was effectively transfixed. She was almost paralyzed. And it was only when the lady made the sign of the cross with her that Bernadette herself was able to make the sign of the cross. Apparently, Mary, as she turned out to be, Bernadette didn't know it at the time, taught Bernadette how to make the sign of the cross in a particularly devout and reverent way. I always say to people when I'm in Lourdes, you know, the sign of the cross for us is usually the beginning of a prayer. It's what we say in order to get on to the main prayer. And of course, people on planes, when they're going to set off a flight, particularly if they think that it's bumpy and they're worried that they might not make it back down to the ground, they make the sign of the cross when they're scared. But Bernadette learned that the sign of the cross was not just the beginning, an introduction to prayer, but it was a prayer in its own right. And she effectively began a pilgrimage, a personal journey over 18 encounters, person to person, with this lady. She did not know who the lady was. And in fact, when she told her sisters and eventually her mother what she'd seen, she didn't even say the lady. She said akero, which was the local word, the dialect word, which basically meant that thing. That was what it was. She didn't know what it was that she'd seen, but she knew it was something special, especially because the lady had a rosary and was praying the rosary with her, which is what happened on the next two apparitions. And it wasn't until the third apparition that the lady spoke and said, "Would you do me the honor of coming here for a fortnight?" Now, nobody had ever spoken to Bernadette like that before. Nobody would say to her, "Would you do me the honor of," particularly when she was working in the local cafe, it was, "Bernadette, bring me another beer," and things like that. But the lady spoke to Bernadette and looked at her like a person speaking at another person, looking at another person. She treated her like a person. The dignity of the person, even if that person is shabbily dressed in rags, even if that person is from the margins of society, that's one of the messages that we learn through the experiences of Bernadette at the Grotto of Lourdes. The lady also said to her, "I'm not going to promise you happiness in this world, but in the other world." People often used to translate that, because of course it was not said in English. People used to translate it as saying, "in the next world." They used to say it was a case of, you know, you'll get your reward in heaven. But Bernadette experienced the other world during those apparitions. She experienced a world of communion with Christ while she was bodily on earth. It sounds difficult to believe. It's almost like, if you're into science fiction, a parallel universe. She was in ecstasy. As we say here, this part of the PowerPoint, incidentally, comes from some of the material that we use when we're training up our volunteers in Lourdes in the background. Just as Jesus called the apostles, Mary invited Bernadette to follow Jesus. And that happiness of the other world is related to what Jesus told us about in the gospel. Think of the Beatitudes, for instance. Bernadette, sorry, I forgot what I was going to say there, but it'll come back to me in a moment. The apparitions continued, but at the time of the 8th apparition, and that was the 24th of February, 1858, some strange things started to happen. Between the 8th and the 12th apparitions, Bernadette's face became harsh and sad and sorrowful. She was no longer blissfully happy and radiant as she had been earlier. And she started to move on her knees towards the back of the grotto and do funny things. She kissed the ground. She ate grass. She smeared her face with some mud and showed it to the crowd. And when she turned around to the crowd, they all said, "She's crazy." And she kept on repeating what apparently the lady was saying to her: penance, penance, pray to God for sinners. So what was all that about? Well, these are recreations of biblical gestures. Bernadette falling to the ground makes us think of Jesus falling on the way to Calvary. Eating the grass reminds us of the people of Israel eating bitter herbs at their Passover meal, and that's referred to in the book of Exodus. And covering the face with mud so that people scarcely recognized her reminds us of that famous extract from the book of Isaiah, from the prophet Isaiah, the reading that we always hear on Good Friday. So disfigured did he look that he was scarcely recognizable. It's almost like Bernadette is reenacting, in a symbolic way, Christ's passion. And let's face it, penance is a word which I think Father Michael did actually use this evening. He certainly used it in almost all of his sermons these last 4 weeks. Penitence, repentance, conversion, recognizing that you're a sinner, and praying to God for sinners, which doesn't just mean praying to God for criminals. It means praying to God for all of us, because we are all sinners if we're honest and we recognize it. And that is a very important part of what we call the message of Lourdes, what we learned through the words of Our Lady and the actions of Bernadette. She effectively, disfigured by the mud, represents mankind disfigured by sin. That stain of original sin that we have to have removed from our souls in baptism. Well, it's like liberating and decluttering our lives in a symbolic way, so that we can receive the saving grace of Christ, which comes, of course, or is symbolized in water. But just before we move on to that, a reminder, therefore, that recognizing that you're a sinner, changing your ways, which is what we're doing in Lent, that is an essential part of the message of Lent. That conversion is something which is an essential part of the message of Lourdes. And I'm sure it's no coincidence that most of the apparitions, and certainly all of the ones that took place during those 15 days, took place during the beginning of Lent. Lent back in 1858 fell on exactly the same dates as it does this year. Ash Wednesday was the 17th of February. in 1858 as it was this year. Now, I just mentioned water. And in the 9th apparition, Bernadette started scratching around in the ground because Bernadette was told by the lady, go to the spring, drink and wash yourself there. She actually thought that the lady meant the river that she'd waded through to get to the cave. But no, Bernadette, or the lady pointed, and Bernadette scratched around, and that's where the water appeared. Now, that in itself is nothing particularly miraculous. Mountain springs appear and gurgle up all the time in the Pyrenees and in other places. If there is a miracle there, it's perhaps that it came precisely where the lady told her to look for it. And the symbolic meaning of the water? Well, we think of the water coming from the side of Christ. We think of Christ, the living water. We think of lots of imagery in the New Testament in particular. Think of the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman. And Jesus said, you know, the water that I can give you is so much better than the water that you could offer me. Water in the Old Testament was a symbol of God's power when he was punishing people by flooding the earth and forcing Noah into his ark, or separating the waters of the Red Sea to allow the people of Israel through and then the Egyptians drowning. But in the New Testament and in Lourdes, water is a symbol of Christ's saving grace. And it reminds us that we need to purify ourselves, not just so that we can receive Jesus, but so that the water of charity can flow from our hearts. Now, between the 13th and the 15th apparitions, several things happened over and over again. That thing, the lady, kept on asking for a chapel. Go and tell the priests to have a chapel built here and for people to come in procession. She was sent on a mission. She had to go back up to the old town where the parish church was, because remember, this was on the outskirts of town, in the middle of nowhere, a good mile or two away from the centre of Lourdes. And we, of course, sometimes get asked to do things that we don't fully understand. We don't know why we're being asked to do it. Certainly when you're doing duties and service in Lourdes, that sometimes happens. But even though it was difficult, she braved the nerves, and the parish priest, Father Peramal, who was a rather crusty and bad-tempered soul, and of course those were the days when a parish priest had several curates, so she didn't know parish priest Father Peramal particularly well, but she went straight up to him. She was a plucky girl, and she passed on the message. Needless to say, the priest was skeptical. There was no reason why he should believe her, and he actually said, well, get her to work a miracle, get her to make the rose bush at the grotto, get it to flower, which logically in February and March would be early, especially because it faced north and got very little sun. And she said, and get the lady to tell you who she is. If I'm going to do all of this for her, the very least she can do is to have the goodness to tell me who the devil she is. But that word procession is important as well, because not only as Christians are we asked to pray, but if we are asked to go in procession, that means praying together, walking together, everybody going in the same direction at the same pace on that pilgrimage called life. In other words, don't just be wrapped up in yourself, sit in a corner of church and pray, but get involved in the life of the church, which is what many of us, through going to Lourdes, have been spurred on to do. Who was this lady? Well, it wasn't until March the 25th, so outside that 15-day spell, when after several days, nearly 2 weeks of not going to the grotto, Bernadette felt drawn to the grotto again. And she'd still not found out the lady's name, so she asked it again, and she was told this time, I am the Immaculate Conception. So she ran up back to the parish priest in his presbytery, breathlessly knocks on the door. In she goes into the waiting room, the parlour, And she says, "I am the Immaculate Conception." And Father Peramal said, "What?" And she repeated it over and over again. He said, do you realize what you're saying?" She said, no, but that's what the lady said to me. I am the Immaculate Conception. And the parish priest was dumbstruck, because the Immaculate Conception, the dogma, which we all know about now, feast day on the 8th of December, it's even, it's a big feast day in some of the Latin countries, Spain and Italy. The dogma was only proclaimed by Pope Pius IX in 1854. So it was only 4 years since the Pope had actually told the priests about it. The feast day was not yet on the calendar. Father Peramal and the priests in Lourdes had not spoken and used this terminology. So how on earth did Bernadette know to say that? And that was what convinced Father Peramal that Bernadette had been speaking with Our Lady. The message of Lourdes, which I've just been summarizing for you very, very quickly there, can be summarized even more quickly with 4-letter P's. Don't think that this is silly. I'm going to get a little bit of interaction here. Please unmute yourself if you can and say to me, what do you reckon are the 4-letter P's that come up in the message of Lourdes? 3 of them are things that Mary said, and one of them is not anything that was said, but is an integral part of the whole circumstances leading up to the apparitions in Lourdes. Any thoughts?
Procession, prayer,
Procession,
prayer
and penance. That's it. Yep. Those are the 3 things that Our Lady called us to do: prayer, penance, and procession. And usually in France, I get involved in a language debate with people, because the French have 2 words. They say pénitence. Or sorry, we have 2 words. The French say pénitence. And of course, penitence to me is not quite the same as penance, because penance is what the priest gives you after confession. Your penance is what you do almost as a punishment to make up for the wrong that you've done. But you don't get the penance until you have shown penitence. And that's why the key part of the message of Lourdes is not just doing things that are out of the ordinary and inconvenient and difficult for you, which of course we do in Lent, when we give up things for Lent, or try to get Mass at 6:30 on a Friday morning, which I never managed to do. All of those come only when you have admitted through penitence that you are a sinner and in need of conversion. The other P I hinted at the start, but I didn't use the word, because we quoted Corinthians and we said foolishness. It was poverty, being poor. Because Bernadette was poor in every sense of the word. Materially poor, the family were on their uppers and had no money. Her health was poor. Their reputation was poor, because they had had a particularly noticeable fall from grace over the space of just 4 years. And also, you know, in terms of education, her education was almost non-existent. She was an intelligent girl, but in terms of education, she was poor. And it is to shame the wise that God gives this knowledge to people who are poor, we might say, rather than foolish in the translation that we usually get in Corinthians. A quick resume of the end of the apparition story. There was a miracle when Bernadette was holding a candle in the 17th apparition. It burnt right down. The flame was licking around her fingers, and she did not register an ounce of pain. And there was a doctor present at the time, because needless to say, crowds were building up. Every apparition had more and more people coming along out of curiosity to see what was going on. And a doctor who looked at her hands afterwards vouched for the fact that she hadn't been burnt at all. Remember, I told you that Bernadette came back to Lourdes so that she could prepare for her first Holy Communion. She made her first Holy Communion on the Feast of Corpus Christi, 3rd of June in 1858. And interestingly, You see, the apparitions were effectively at an end there. It's almost like God had sent his mother to help Bernadette prepare through that intimate contact that she had with him and the apparitions, sharing in that other world of spiritual ecstasy and communion. So there was only one other apparition, which was 6 weeks afterwards, when she felt the urge once again to go to the grotto. Now, the authorities had barricaded it at that point, and the combination of the barricades and the numbers of curious people who were still now going down to see the place where this was in the news, you know, so she couldn't get anywhere near the grotto. She was on the opposite side of the river. But she said, even though she was further away, she still saw the Blessed Virgin Mary, as clear as ever and more beautiful than ever. From 1860 to 1866, she moved into what's called the hospice. That's not a place for the terminally ill. It's the name that they use in Lourdes for the convent, which the Sisters of Nevers had already established in the town, and they took her in as a pupil, partly to complete her education and partly to protect her from all the journalists and curious people who were coming to Lourdes in increasing numbers to see who this woman was. And it was as a result of living with the sisters in the hospice that she decided that her vocation was to join their order. And in 1866, she went up to Nevers, and eventually she made her profession and became a nun in the convent of Saint-Gildard in Nevers. And just to remind you, Nevers is a long, long way away from Lourdes. It was an entire day's journey on the train, changing in Bordeaux. And she never, ever came back to Lourdes after she went to Nevers. She died in Nevers on the 16th of April, 1879, so aged just 35, because her time in Nevers, which in itself could be the subject of another talk, I haven't got the time to go into details, suffice it to say that although when she could, she worked in the infirmary, helping the nuns who were nursing the sick and the poor in Nevers, very often she was a patient in that infirmary herself because of her asthma and her tuberculosis, which is what she eventually died of in 1879. And you might well have seen the pictures of Bernadette in the coffin, because her body was exhumed 3 times as part of the investigations into her possible canonization. And on each occasion, the body was found to be intact. First occasion, which was 1909, so 30 years later, remarkably so. They have had to put wax on it because the skin was going grey as a result of not being properly handled during the previous exhumations. But as we know, she was canonized in 1933, if I remember rightly. Now, she was, in a sense, the first sick pilgrim to go to the shrine at Lourdes. She wasn't the first person to be cured there, though. She never was. As we said, she died at 35, which even by the standards of those days was early. In fact, the first person who was cured in Lourdes was at the time of the 12th apparition, when 1,500 people had gathered around, and a lady called Catherine Latapie, who had a paralyzed arm, put her arm in the water of the spring and regained movement in it. That was the first recognized cure in Lourdes. But there's a lot of healing, there's a lot of love that takes place in Lourdes. Not always physical cures, there's spiritual healing as well. Another question for you, if you'd like to unmute yourselves, does anybody know how many people have been cured in Lourdes? And how many miracles have there been?
No.
Because there's only ever been 70 cures which have been officially recognized as miracles.
Oh.
But there have been over 7,000 cures which have been officially recognized as having no logical physical explanation. And again, something that I could tell you about at great length, but I haven't got the time, would be the process by which a medical committee with doctors, not only Catholic doctors, but they also get people of no particular faith to study the dossier to make absolutely sure, you know, playing devil's advocate, you might say, that if a person is declared as cured, there has to be absolutely no physical explanation for it. It has to be a sudden cure. It has to be a cure that is long-term and permanent and not just a temporary remission. There are all sorts of criteria, and 7,000 have passed that test, but only 70 are miracles. And the reason why is because a cure is a word that a doctor can use. So the doctors can say this person has been cured. Miracle is the theological term, and only the person's bishop can say that that is a miracle, that that is the work of God. Now, a quick reading. If you were at Mass today, you'll have heard the first letter of St. Peter, who said, above all, never let your love for each other grow insincere, since love covers over many a sin. Welcome each other into your houses without grumbling. Each one of you has received a special grace. So like good stewards responsible for all these different graces of God, put yourselves at the service of others. And people inspired by Bernadette and how she kept herself at the service of others in the convent, even when she herself was physically suffering and weak and indeed dying. Bernadette is the inspiration for so many people who go to Lourdes and show love and show God's love in the service for others. So it's a very practical form of faith that you often see in Lourdes. It's practical because you see people taking part in the processions. And it's practical when you see that people spend good money to go down to Lourdes, not for a holiday, but to work looking after other people. There's a French word, accueil. You can see it there on that picture. And the French word accueil means welcome. They use it, you often see it on welcome desks like that. Bernadette was welcomed when she went to the Grotto. She was welcomed by the lady who didn't speak to her until the third time that they met, but she put her at ease by smiling, by moving her hands gracefully, by taking her rosary, by praying with her. Something that we often say to people, you don't necessarily need to speak the person's language to be welcoming. And that's something that's often proven or indeed put to the test in that multinational atmosphere that Lourdes is. And a couple of biblical quotations for you. There are lots one could choose. Matthew in chapter 25, when Jesus said, when I was hungry, you fed me, when I was naked, you clothed me, and so on and so forth. And the disciples said, but what are you talking about, Jesus? We've never done that to you. And he said, but whenever you do it for the least of these brothers, you do it for me, because you do God's work with the people who need your help. And you show hospitality, that word hospitality, as in the book of Genesis, when Abraham took people in as they were passing through, and he eventually discovered that they were angels. And hospitality is a very important word for me. Being welcoming is something I always try to do in my life in the English Martyrs Parish. It's why I've been a welcomer and why I'm now a steward at Mass. But hospitality is something else, because we have an organization in Lourdes called the Hospitality, a family of Christian men and women, well over 130 years old now. And it exists to welcome all the other people, groups or individuals, who come to Lourdes. To welcome them, especially the sick and disabled pilgrims, but all pilgrims. To help them on their way through their pilgrimage, and to help the priests in the sanctuary to organize the major celebrations. And we pass on the message of Lourdes as we received it from Bernadette, which is basically what I'm doing to you now. But those of us who work with the Hospitality, and we can, if we wish, make a pledge to join the Hospitality, and that pledge means that we go in service every year, which is why, since I went for the first time in 1975, I actually went with Bishop Crispian, because at the time he was just Father Crispian. He was the chaplain at Oxford University, and so I've known him since 1974, in fact. When we go to Lourdes, we make the pledge to go regularly, every year whenever possible, but certainly regularly. But we also make the pledge to make sure that Lourdes isn't just something that we do for a week or two in the summer. It's something that we bring home with us, and something that by being welcoming, by being aware of people who are sick and helping them, we try to change their lives. So here we are, welcoming people at the railway station and the airport and outside the baths, and of course at the grotto. And we help out at the ceremonies that take place in the sanctuary, the masses at the grotto, the international mass in the underground basilica, the Blessed Sacrament procession, and the torchlight procession. I don't know if you know what those buildings are. Those buildings are called the accueil. That word accueil comes up a lot, as I said, in France. And the accueil are the buildings where the sick people can be accommodated. They can stay in hotels if they want, but many of the pilgrimages, they put their sick into these accueil because they're basically hostels that are designed to cope with people who might be in wheelchairs or even on stretchers and bedbound. There are two of them, in fact. The one at the top is the Accueil Notre Dame, and the one underneath is the Accueil Marie Saint-Fré. And the people who work in those accueils, mostly the ladies, it has to be said. Lourdes is quite a traditional, old-fashioned and sexist organisation, but these days there are more and more men getting involved as well with doing the housework or helping in the sacristies. Even I've seen a man in the sewing and embroidery workshop, only one admittedly, but I have seen one. So there are all sorts of things that can be done by way of service. And one of the things I always say to people is that we don't necessarily work with the sick, but a lot of what we do is behind the scenes in the background, getting the place ready for when the sick move in. And therefore, the helpers who travel with them, they don't have to worry about all of the mundane things that they can just take for granted. We provide the infrastructure that they plug into while they are in Lourdes. Down at the baths, welcoming them and accompanying them. On the left, as you can see, men in the men's baths and ladies in the ladies' baths, and never the twain shall meet. Because Mary said, go and drink at the spring and wash in it. She didn't say bathe in it, incidentally. She only said drink it and wash it. But over the years, people have just developed this love for actually fully immersing themselves in the baths. It's a little bit like, almost like our equivalent of the baptism by full immersion that we had in the parish a few Easters ago. And some people look on it actually as an opportunity to sort of repeat their baptism. You know, it's an act of faith. It is an act of faith when you're going in the same water that people have used through the previous couple of hours. And in fact, at the moment, because of COVID, the baths are closed for obvious reasons. But it is an act of faith. And people work inside the baths as well to provide that moral or spiritual or practical help. Now, have you heard people talk about Lourdes water? Have you heard them call it miraculous water? Have you heard them call it holy water? It's not. I have to tell you, it's completely and utterly ordinary water. It's only holy water if you ask a priest to bless it. It is perfectly ordinary mountain stream water that comes up out of the mountains and is stored in vast tanks so that it can be poured into the baths twice a day, morning and afternoon, and of course channeled also to the various water taps and fountains that people drink it from or fill their plastic bottles to take home. Now, these cures that we looked at earlier briefly, they don't necessarily depend on the water. It's not the water that cures them. It's God who cures them, because like we said, the water is a symbol, just like at baptism. It's a symbol or a sign of God's saving grace. Sorry, what was that, Melly, you were saying? I didn't quite catch that, sorry.
Well, I'm so sorry.
Oh, no worries. How much water, therefore, do you need to drink or bathe in? You don't need to bathe. Somebody asked that question of Bernadette once, and she said, 1 drop is enough. 1 drop is enough, but you must have faith. So, to end with, these are some of the key elements of the hospitalier spirit. This is something that we always tell our new volunteers about when I'm helping to train them up and welcome them into service. And they're words that can apply to us as we go about our life in the parish or in the town. Be there to serve people, putting your own interests first. Be available to help them. Can people rely on you? I love this quotation. Be humble. Do what you're asked to do without arguing. Bernadette would have loved to have been a proper nurse or a doctor, but she didn't have the qualifications. She took her all her time to learn to read and write. She was just a nursing orderly. She was a dog's body working in the infirmary. She would sweep up for the other nurses. And when Our Lady wanted her to have a rest, that was when she would fall ill and she'd have to lie up as a patient in the infirmary for days or weeks on end. She actually said, in a totally down-to-earth and unpretentious way, she said, Our Lady just uses me like a sweeping brush or a broom. When she's finished with me, she hangs me up on the back of the door and I can have a rest in bed for a week or two. Learning new ways of doing things, finishing the task completely right to the end. This is something very important. I haven't told you, but do you remember when I said that Our Lady said to Bernadette, can you come here for 15 days for a fortnight? There were 2 occasions during that fortnight when she went down to the grotto and the lady did not come. And did Bernadette say, oh, that's it, she's let me down, I'm not going to come again. If she's not going to come and see me, I'm not going to come again? No, she didn't. She came along the following day. She showed that spirit of constancy. She didn't give up at the first hurdle. And generosity of heart, strength, and intelligence, and respect for the individual. Those are some of the things that I've learnt through doing service in Lourdes with people in the hospitality, through following the example of St. Bernadette, working for the hospitality, which is, as I say, a hospitality of welcome. There's Bernadette as well. One last quotation from her. She says, the first movement isn't ours. The second one is. We've had great debates as to what on earth she meant by that. Basically, Bernadette was a naturally impulsive person. She would speak first and think later, or act first and think later. She got herself into trouble sometimes. When she went into the convent, the nurse, the novice mistress, they would frequently fall out because she'd be too cheeky. She'd answer back. But then your first reaction, the first thing you do, you might not have full control over. It might be instinctive, but then you have a few seconds to stop and think. And you should by then be in control of your second action, even if you're not in control of your first one.